Well, this is Friday night at Carey Institute. I'm Bill Schlesinger, the president of the Institute. Welcome back to the fall lecture series. Tonight we'll kick off our fall lecture series, which we hope, as we did last year, to do at roughly monthly intervals. Check our website for actual dates and times. Most will be Friday nights at 7. But occasionally, when we have to stretch to get the right speaker on the right night, we do strange and different things. Before we get into tonight's speaker, let me say that next month we have one of our own, Gary Lovett, who's sitting right back there, talking about pests and pathogens in forests, a summary of a number of his recent studies here at the Institute. That's October 19. That is a Friday night at 7. And we hope to see you here for that. Certainly the threats to the forests in this area are very real. And we like to think the Carey Institute has made some real strides in informing the scientific community and the public about what is in our future. Tonight we have a special treat in the form of John Fitzpatrick, the director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I'd say his name is right up there with Roger Torrey Peterson and David Sibley and a small other cast of luminaries in the world of ornithology, some past, some present, but that's a very rarefied club that John's a member of. He completed his PhD at Princeton in 1978, has had a career studying the Florida scrub jay, largely at Archibald Biological Station, itself a delightful place down in Lake Placid, Florida. That has led to his current appointment as a chaired professor at Cornell and director of the lab there. Along that journey, he's focused his attention on all kinds of species, the ivory-billed woodpecker, the plight of birds worldwide, the latest issue of Living Bird, which came to our mailbox, I think, last week, has a wonderful picture of a new species in Peru, the Cirra barbet, that has been named, scientifically named, the Latin name, Fitzpatrick, I think is, in his honor. That you don't run into a whole lot of people around the street that have a species named after them. And tonight we have one right here. I know as I look at my own lists of birds and checklists and stuff, and I ask myself all the time, do birds make a difference? I guess what I'm really asking is, am I spending my time wisely, writing all these things down and spending so much time watching them and enjoying it? But it's interesting to ask what role birds play in ecosystems in our lives. And tonight, John will tell us not only that, but how birds can save the world. John Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate the invitation to come over here and see the Carey Institute for the first time. I've known about it for decades, and it's a real pleasure to see the place and meet the people, and I appreciate the hospitality and certainly appreciate the big group that's come out tonight on a beautiful summer Friday evening. It's a treat to be able to talk at one of the world-class ecological research institutes about things relating to how humans and the ecological system can live side by side. That's functionally what the Carey Institute is clearly driving towards by its own writings and strategic plannings. And tonight I want to touch exactly on that idea and start with the overall hypothesis that it is both possible and desirable that we do get to develop our cultures richly and successfully and fully over the long term, side by side with intact natural systems. That's my mantra. That's my statement of purpose for what I'm trying to do and what I believe many of us in our professions these days are trying to do. If that's going to be the case ultimately, and everybody in this room, you don't need me to tell you that we're not currently in that situation yet. Humans are not successfully living side by side with functioning natural systems, although there are places where it's beginning to be true. We'd like to imagine the world in which it's true worldwide. If that's going to ever happen, We need two things to be true. At least it has to be that every human generation wants it to be true, because it doesn't happen by accident. And we have to have real-time proxies for being able to measure how we're doing at it. The only way we can decide whether we are, in fact, reaching stability with natural systems is having some easy way to measure that. And it's no secret, of course, because of what's on this picture and the title of the talk tonight, that I want to make the case that birds supply a spectacularly available and very sensitive opportunity as a proxy for measuring this. But you don't need to think about birds in that way, in that sort of pinhead. That's a sort of a scientist way to look at birds. Everybody loves birds. That's the power of birds. That's what's cool about them. You don't need to know anything at all about them. And you don't need to force yourself to learn anything at all about them, to love them. You can just listen to them and enjoy them. I want to illustrate the idea by playing a sound that I'm guessing few of you have heard here. It's possible that some of you know what this is. I'm just going to play a sound. This sound is from the Cornell Lab's Library of Natural Sounds, the Macaulay Library, the world's largest collection of sound recordings from nature. Here's a sound. Pretty cool. Vaguely jazz-like even. A little haunting. Mysterious and beautiful. You don't need to know anything at all about birds and walk by a place and just hear this and think, yeah, it's amazing. You can hear a piece of music come out of the woods like that. Now, let me tell you what that sound is. It's one of these. These are the birds that the Polynesian emperors decorated their robes with when they arrived in the Hawaiian Islands. We now know the dates pretty exactly. That was about 1,200 years ago when the Polynesians first colonized the big islands of Hawaii. And those larger islands in the Hawaiian chain each had one of these birds, the o'os. And what you just heard was an o'o. You heard the last o'o because by the turn of the 20th century, 4 of the 5 o'os had gone extinct as a consequence of humans using up the landscape and introducing things that those o'os could not live with. And what you just heard was a recording of the last o'o, the last surviving o'o. The Kauai o'o was recorded on the top of the Alakai swamp in the island of Kauai. And it was discovered there. What you're hearing is a recording of a male coming in and singing to the recordist. Why? Because it was actually the last o'o. It had actually believed to have been extinct for some decades. It was rediscovered in the late 1970s. And thankfully, a biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got this recording, brought it in. They're surveying the forest to find whether there were a surviving population. Sadly, all they could find was this one male, and it's coming in. Now, o'os were duetters. They sang, and the female would respond, like Carolina wren does sometimes, other species of birds. The male sings, female responds. So what you're hearing is a male singing, waiting for the response when you play back. And nothing would respond. Now let's hear it again. Hear him wait. That difference in you between when you first heard the sound and thought, yeah, birds are cool, I love these bird sounds, and listen to this. Just 1 minute later, but knowing a bit about what that sound represents, knowing a bit about what that represents relating to humans and the landscape, to our choices, past and future, to the relationships that we've chosen to have with the landscape to result in the loss of this. That difference between the first time you heard it and now, that is the power of birth. And it goes on and on. here's a bird quiz. Some of you must be birders. So I want to tell you that I didn't take this, Kevin McGowan took this picture in Ithaca, New York, about 7 years ago. What is it? That bill is pretty short. That is not a wimble. That is an Eskimo curlew. It's Cornell University's only specimen of an Eskimo curlew, which happens to be stuffed, and we put it out on the grass. So give us a sense of what it might look like if we spotted an Eskimo curlew. Sorry. You won't ever see one of these. We took them all. We took every last one of them. They were called prairie pigeons when the market hunters got out to the Midwest in the spring and shot them by the tens of thousands and loaded their wagons full of them and take them back to market. Prairie pigeons, these huge swarms of Eskimo curlews, we took them all. Why were they called prairie pigeons? Because those same market hunters could no longer hunt this, the most abundant bird that has ever lived on the planet. The passenger pigeon, which used to migrate over Millbrook, New York, or the Hudson Valley back in the pre-Millbrook days by the billions with a B. We took them all. That is the relationship that humans expressed in its fullest extent toward the turn of the 1900s, the end of the 19th century. And it was not limited just to birds, as everybody here knows. Look at this picture, folks. You look at that quickly and you think you're in the Sitka spruce forests of the British Columbian rainforest. No. Folks, these are sugar maples. In Petoskey, Michigan in the 1870s. You will never see a sugar maple that looks like that. Your grandchildren will never see a sugar maple that looks like that. We took every last one of them. We took the big 15-foot diameter sycamore trees in the Midwestern bottomlands. And so it goes. And one parenthetical question you have to ask today, we all have to ask today, is that era, that end of the 19th century, is that era over? Talk to the cod fishermen and ask your question, what's going to happen with bluefin tuna? But the point of the late 20th century is not all of that gloom. There are some very interesting positives underway as well. And we can go back to Hawaii for an example, as we are here. Many of you might have been on the spot. It's a national park. It's Haleakala National Park in East Maui. You're looking northeastward to the windward slopes of Maui, one of the wettest places on the planet, where the forest is draped in mosses and liverworts and tree ferns. And inside that forest are a number of species of birds, 3 of which were believed extinct at one point and then rediscovered. And the discovery of these birds again in the 1950s and 60s actually helped galvanize a remarkable set of behaviors among humans of a variety of political persuasions and organizations. Small landowners, larger landowners, public and private, NGOs spearheaded by the Nature Conservancy, brought the whole group together to create this amazing thing which exists today called the East Maui Watershed Partnership, fenced off that entire windward slope, began to remove all of the feral ungulates, pigs especially, that were in there. And lo and behold, the lobeliad diversity, which is highest in the world in these forests, begins to rebound. The ecology comes back. The birds begin to come back. That place appears to be saved. What brought them together to begin with? Birds. This idea that birds turn us on to problems that are underway out there, many of which are our own doing, is not new. It's not anymore a headline. This bird is the symbol of it. The peregrine falcon, which was functionally extinct from the lower 48, taught us that we were poisoning ourselves, literally, with DDT and related pesticide compounds. We changed our behavior. We took those off the U.S. market, at least. And with a little help from breeders, we ended up putting these birds back in a much cleaner ecosystem, and lo and behold, the peregrine falcon came off the endangered species list before the end of the 20th century. And it's now much more abundant today than it was in the late 1800s as the passenger pigeon was disappearing. So here is a remarkable success story. Why? We watched it, we learned what it was telling us, we listened to its story, we changed our behavior, and the bird comes back. Birds and ecosystems do have capacity to rebound and come back if we listen. Here is, of course, the poster child for the same problem in the western U.S. and the actual Sitka spruce forests and Douglas fir forests of the west. This is the spotted owl, the loathsome sight to the old loggers of the late 20th century who believed that they had the right to take every last old-growth stand in the world. But in fact, I want to show you that owl in its genuine scale. That's the same owl, sitting at approximately the correct scale in that forest. And that, folks, that is what the Endangered Species Act is about. The owl is indeed on the endangered species list, and it has set in motion a number of actions that are causing the preservation and restoration of big areas of the western forests. But that owl is just the beacon. And the amazing thing about the Endangered Species Act is that that point I just made is actually written right into the Act. It's baked right into the Act, in the statement of purpose of the Act. The purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect the ecosystems upon which these species depend. Written, prepared by Congress, signed by President Nixon in 1973. Amazing piece of biological wisdom right there in the Act of Congress. Might be the last time. Actually, that period, as many of you here know and can remember, that period was amazing for this kind of a thing. And I have to say that we've had two environmental heroes as presidents of the U.S. One of them is obvious. Teddy Roosevelt set into motion the very idea that we could put conservation action into government agencies and expect the government as an entity to begin to protect the natural resources that we inherited for our future generations. That idea was fundamentally put into place by Teddy Roosevelt in the turn of the 20th century. The second environmental hero, and it just hurts me to say it. I'm sorry, I was in college when I just loathed him. I just loathed him. But look, you guys know what he got signed, right? Endangered Species Act is just one. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Wild and Scenic River Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. You got EPA going. You got the NEPA environmental regulations underway for the first time. All of these environmental laws, which are now bedrock for how we protect the environment today at a federal level, signed by this man. Why? Anybody know the name? Who was responsible for that? He was a birder. John Ehrlich, the Watergate criminal, was a bird watcher from early in his life. This is serious, a true story. He was an Eagle Scout, he was an avid camper, and he was a birder. He saw the Ross's gull up in Newburyport Harbor that I missed. John Ehrlich, Nixon's chief domestic advisor, was a committed environmentalist and knew, in fact, Nixon told him, John, I don't know anything about the environment. We'll get that. Single-handedly worked with the agencies, quietly in many cases, getting these things up and written up before Congress, much of which had been sort of in preparation during the 60s, but he's the one that one by one got these through. Why? The power of birds. As well, by the way, a good lesson, the power of individuals to make real differences. A story that needs to be told with great clarity, especially for us aging veterans of the Watergate era. Okay, well, we've been talking about the Endangered Species Act, but really the point of tonight's conversation is less about Kauai o'os and peregrine falcons than about The birds that you guys get to listen to every spring in the woods, the common birds. This, one of the most beautiful songsters in our deciduous woods of the East, known to everybody here, of course, the wood thrush. Look at the pattern of the population of wood thrushes in eastern North America over the last 30 years, 40 years. Steady, inexorable, unchanging decline. One of our common birds. The signal exists out there among the common birds, not just the ones about to go extinct. In fact, the common birds actually give us, scientifically speaking, much better signal than the super rare birds. And the wood thrush is giving us a very big signal indeed. It's not the only one. Both species of meadowlarks are now down to about a third their numbers compared to just 30 years ago. Look at rusty blackbird over the last 40 years. And cerulean warbler are well known to be the most rapidly declining eastern North American wood warbler. There are lots of species and lots of habitats out there giving us signals. Why are they going down? We don't know in many cases. Shouldn't we? Couldn't we learn by studying that? What's this bird, by the way? This is a fun bird quiz for you birders. This is a species of North American bird with breeding bird survey data. Where it's red, the bird is significantly declining. Where it's blue, it's stable or increasing. Anybody want to guess what that species is? Nice fun little bird quiz. Shout out if you think you know. Look how widespread. Crow is a good guess for that distribution. It's not it, but it's your very common, familiar flicker. One of the most rapidly declining birds in North America at this point. Depending on where you measure it, 3 to 7% annual declines of this species. Probably for a combination of reasons having to do with lawn chemicals, competing species like starlings, and the fact that humans hate dead trees. Flicker is a dead tree specialist, and humans hate dead trees. We take them out when they begin to die. Right? It's our habit all over the countryside. And flickers depend on dead trees, as do many other species of woodpeckers. The woodpecker signal, certain woodpecker signals, are showing us the consequence of our changing landscape use and values. And I want to do a little quick diversion here because I hate to talk about birds to a interested crowd and not take it down to Florida for just a second. Because we have another story here about disturbance. Basically, woodpeckers and the story of woodpecker decline is a story about disturbance and our impatience with it. And one place to go to study disturbance in great detail and with a lot of different various versions of it is Florida. One of those forms of disturbance just zoomed by in the form of Isaac and missed Florida. But here's another very, very important form of disturbance. And of course, in Florida, you take this seriously. There's a lightning strike frequency map for the lower 48 of the U.S. And you can see that Florida is the bullseye for lightning. The summer convective thunderstorms produce about 50 ground flashes of lightning per square mile per year. Most of them in the summertime, mostly during the season when everything can burn. If you've been in Florida in the summer, you know you take lightning seriously. About 100 people a year killed by lightning. That's more than the rest of North America put together. And where you get lightning, you get ignition. And where you get ignition in natural systems, you get fire, widespread fire. And where you've had widespread fire for millions of years, you get plant communities and animal communities that are evolved in the presence of fire with strategies to deal with fire. And one of the most distinctive places like this that has this characteristic is this very peculiar ancient system in Florida called the oak scrub. And I've been studying for 40 years now a bird that lives in that scrub. It's the poster child for the Florida oak scrub. This is the endemic Florida scrub jay. Lives only in Florida. It's Florida's only endemic species of bird. The bird only species entirely restricted to that state. There's its approximate current distribution in red. And there are its numbers based on a series of ever more accurate surveys that we've done, especially beginning in the 80s and 90s, and now very recently completed another survey that shows that this bird is going extinct. Florida's only endemic species is in peril of disappearing. We've been studying it in detail for a number of years, decades now, at this beautiful place, a comparable peer institution to the Cary. This is the Archbold Biological Station in Central Florida, a spectacular place to see wild Florida for any of you who want to visit and see a sister institute down there. They've just recently completed, by the way, a very beautiful new learning center that makes it very amenable for daytime visitors. We get to study, this happens to be my wife Molly, who's got one of our study organisms on her head there. We get to see these birds close up, and they are absurdly tameable because they used to sit on the tops of wild animals as well as other things. And what we learned, I'll give you a very quick scrub jay lecture, hopefully in about 30 seconds. They live on year-round dependent territories. I'm showing you the mosaic here. Each 6-digit label shows a single scrub jay territory. The building rooftop that you saw in a previous picture is in orange there. So you can see over a several square mile area a completely saturated mosaic of scrub jay territories. Within each territory, the male and female pair, they pair for life. Family values like crazy. Divorce rate less than 2%. The kids, speaking of the family values, the kids stick around and help mom and dad raise next year's young. So they have an extended family system, a cooperative breeding system. Very interesting in its own right, behaviorally and ecologically. For purposes of this talk, though, I want to stress one feature that we began to recognize only by about 1990. That we begin to see a pattern in the declines and extinctions of this bird that were teaching us something we had not previously suspected. We got to study a little population of jays bordering Archbold, and there's what that population was doing. We began to suspect that this is a bird that was very closely tuned to the fire cycle, and so we did what any good ecological team does. We try to conduct an experiment. We did an experiment in that spot. There's our colleague Bob Curry escaping the experiment as fast as you can. We burned the heck out of that piece of scrub, and there is the result over 20 years. So we've just finished a 20-year-long experiment, now 22-year-long experiment in that track, demonstrating something that was completely confirming our hypothesis about the Florida scrub jay. Namely, it is a disturbance-prone bird. It is a disturbance specialist. It lives because of catastrophes, namely fire. I don't personally think of fire as a catastrophe, even when I hear stories about the West right now. Because in the West, it just happens at different scales. In Florida, it turns out, our work with the scrub jay, Eric Mangus's work with a variety of plants, Jim Carroll's work with spiders, and all the people who are studying the organisms of the scrub are basically showing the same thing. These organisms are all built for a return of a fire about every 5 to 15 years. Without the fire, you can see what happens. We actually specifically prohibited fire from burning in this area for that 20-year period. And you can see the demonstration of a natural fire cycle now in the population. Confirming our hypothesis, lo and behold, plants galore on the endangered species list in Central Florida, 40 or 50 of them, restricted to this habitat, all of them fire dependent. Arthropods now beginning to catch up and join the endangered species list, same story. What's true for the scrub jay is true for all of these other creatures and plants underneath the scrub jay. The scrub jay is simply the indicator. The first of those that was put on the endangered species list. There we are, back to that point again. And so we now know, and are trying desperately to spread this word into a variety of management entities of various scales across most of the U.S., that fire is an essential ingredient in natural systems. I'm here to tell you, Smokey the Bear he's wrong. Dead and buried. He's wrong. Fire is essential. In fact, I'm dying to make the anti-Bambi movie. Remember Bambi? For a couple of different reasons, okay? But you remember Bambi, the fire comes in, the hunters are all bad, and the fire comes through and all that stuff. Well, the fire is essential to these systems, or the natural plants and animals begin to go extinct. And so we know that the Florida scrub jay represents this very important phrase in ecology and conservation and restoration right now, indicator species. The idea that they indicate features of a natural system that allow us to measure quickly and easily some things that are actually much more profound and important at lower scales within the system. Birds are phenomenally sensitive and very accessible indicators. And so we know that in the areas of big fire across the southeast, we can go back in time and actually ask questions about things that might have disappeared that used to use fires at the grand scales that they used to occur when the great southern pine lands were still there. When those big pine forests of the southeast used to burn, they produced hamburgers of a variety of sizes and taxonomic levels, like these buprested and cerambycid beetle larvae. And guess who ate these great big hamburgers of the southeastern forests? When we shaved, as we did with those sugar maples, when we shaved the entire southeast and left, this is no exaggeration, exactly 200 acres of virgin longleaf pine forest. When we did that, we took away the entire life savings and resource base for this grand woodpecker that used to depend on those great big trees for its living. And so the disappearance of the Iberville woodpecker is fundamentally about the disappearance of those great big forests. These fire stories we hear all the time. We're hearing them again this summer. This is a particularly dry year, so we're seeing it more often. But summers like this and places like this near San Diego in California, it's been happening forever. And guess what? Indicator species in every one of them. California gnatcatcher in the case of the California systems of chaparrals. One more disturbance story I will just make a reference to, the Buick's wren, which except for one pair that lives in Illinois. I'm going to tell you the story. This summer we had some students at the lab at Cornell, young birders, and I gave a quick little version of this talk, and I said, bet you $100 none of you has ever seen a Buick's wren east of the Mississippi. And one of the kids says, I have. And I thought, no, yeah, he's gone to see the one pair that lives east of the Mississippi in Illinois. But the bird is functionally extinct. It's a bird that used to live east, be abundant in Kentucky, in disturbances. But I'm going to stop that part of the story and just ask the question, where did these data come from that I'm showing you here?
Birders?
You gathered them. You gathered them. These are Christmas bird count data. Almost all the data I've been showing you this entire night up to now are gathered by amateur birders. And you are not alone at this point. As everybody here knows, there are millions of you, depending on which survey, and all of them show the same result, basically. Tens of millions. Certain of the biggest surveys suggest 40 to 70 million people above the age of 16 are reasonably avid bird watchers. That's a huge army. Think of the power of that many people watching birds. And what I want to do with the rest of the talk is ask the question, why should all that information that you gather when you sip your coffee in the morning disappear with you on your way to work? What about if all that information got gathered together? That's fundamentally a major reason why there is a Cornell Lab of Ornithology now. It's one of our signature efforts at this point, is to begin to get the world to think of ourselves this way. You are human sensors. And the lab exists not for the birds. The birds are just the indicator. The lab exists to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity. And we do it with research and education and this amazing thing, citizen science, focused on birds and other charismatic organisms like whales and elephants. Incidentally, just quickly, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is by no means just about birds. This is the whole series of actual programs headed by faculty or senior scientist staff at the lab, a wide variety of ways in which we can use birds and other charismatic organisms to accomplish this purpose. We also have a very complex and ever-growing network of relationships across Cornell University that vary from the traditional areas of ecology and evolutionary biology, behavior, natural resources, and so on, up into, as you'll see now in the next few slides, the most advanced computer science areas in any of the major research universities in the world. And we are increasingly offering what we do in the form of information in a variety of ways over the internet. The internet is our tool for being a global communication device. Well, this idea of citizen science began to take shape, especially in the 1990s, when we asked, for example, about that cerulean warbler, could we figure out where they are? And so we literally started a nationwide cerulean warbler atlas project in which we asked citizens to help us map them. And so we mapped every breeding population of cerulean warblers. In the process of mapping them, we began just by getting it on the screen and having people get out there and count. That itself began to put magnifying glasses on very important places, very important forest tracts, where, for example, Tennessee then saved 50,000 acres of their best cerulean warbler habitat, and so on. So just the act of getting citizens to think about organizing that kind of information itself accomplishes direct on-the-ground conservation. We began also to learn about the science behind declines, and I particularly single out the wood thrush because I mentioned it earlier tonight. We used citizen science data together with acid rain data to demonstrate in a couple of very important papers in PNAS that there is a very, very sharp threshold of acid deposition above which wood thrushes don't exist. They are very responsive to acid rain, probably because of what the effects of that acid rain are on the soil arthropods and mollusks that they depend upon. That itself is now being studied. We had a Project Peter Watch underway that allowed us to begin to track the spread of a wild bird disease more accurately than has ever been tracked before. This disease, which is mainly endemic to house finches, is now spread across the whole eastern U.S. and has finally reached California. And it is a model system right now for a 15-year-long study of emergent diseases. We can use birds to teach at every level of education, and especially including in formal environments where teachers can use birds to actually teach some of the basic science, technology, engineering, and math aspects that they are required to. Birds are fun. Learning math turns out to be fun if you get to do it with birds. And it's not by any means restricted to beautiful suburban and rural habitats that we can do this. The actual fact is that there are plenty of birds in the middle of our biggest cities for people to learn the basic fundamentals of science called observation. Getting people to watch is the first step. Watching starts opening all the thought processes about what then can ultimately become studying, learning, and singing. And, of course, the arrival of the internet became of signature importance for us, and we got to be able to start teaching about life on the internet, including birth and hatching and development and fledgling and even death. And we had people calling the lab saying, "Aren't you rescuing those birds from that rat snake?" And so the explosion of the internet and the exploration of ways in which we could use it is really upon us right now, and we've had no more fun than with these very cool live webcams. And I got to tell you that the first live webcam that we went up turned out to surprise us in a large number of ways. This was the barn owl cam in Italy, Texas, in which we learned, along with the rest of the world, that barn owls do it every night. No, every night. Multiple times a night. They do it way before the eggs are laid. They do it all the way through egg laying. They do it through the nestling period. The male brings in a mouse and they do it, and as the fledglings are growing up, they're still doing it, and they're enjoying it. Nobody who studied barn owls or any other owl actually recognizes it. importance of this behavior as a pair maintenance. So we still joke about getting Pfizer to sponsor this site. I'm told by my board that would be in bad taste. By the way, I just want to ask a question. Did anybody here tune into the Lab of Ornithology's websites this spring with the red-tailed hawks and the great blue herons? I was going to keep my eye on the clock and see if I had time to do this. I'm going to go ahead and do this just because I'm so thrilled about what that did. If I can do this. Oh, it doesn't mind. Sorry, these are my goggles. I'm looking for the Internet Explorer. So here. This is just about a 2-minute vignette. That's arrival day. There we go again, Pfizer. Very unusual. 5 eggs and great blue herons. Great horned owl attacked that bird. 3 a.m. just ambient light. And that little guy, number 5 there, always was behind. Bird's eye view of South Dakota. Well, thanks for. So I want to go on, and really my final segment just stresses what we began to experiment with and what we now regard as a signature moment in science. And that is the idea that we can use the internet literally for what it is, namely exactly a two-way device, not just a we offer it to you device. Namely, we learn from you and we can give back to you in a sharing way. We first experimented that with this idea, great backyard bird count, in the late 1990s when internet was still young. There's the date for the upcoming one. I suspect there's a good number of Great Backyard Bird Watchers here. If you haven't done it, how many of you have done Great Backyard Bird Count? Okay, you can still up that number. That's good. Thank you very much for doing it. What is remarkable about it to me is that for a little bit of time, these are our numbers over the last several years, and those are good numbers. They're not just massive, but the coverage is beginning to be pretty impressive. And I'm not going to tell biology stories here, with one minor exception. I really want you to focus on just the fact of all this data over a 4-day period. This is American robin last year. You can see the coverage. We have a snapshot of the bird's range at the big scale, and we can zoom in and look at the bird's range at very small scales, which gives us an opportunity to actually study things like the dynamics of range boundaries in the middle of winter and how those themselves change year to year. The biology of what's available from these data gathered over a 4-day period in February, just after Valentine's Day, at the point, by the way, at which birds reach about their southernmost place in the winter cycle and are beginning to have the hormones going, and it's just turning around. So it's sort of what I was about talking about, when they get sloshed down to the farthest south they're going to be, and they're just turning back around. That's when we do the Great Backyard Bird Count. Much later in the cycle, by the way, than the Christmas bird count does, which is a lot of birds that are still actually moving south. There is our region right here, 2012, so just last February, from you can see the Hudson Valley there, Lake Champlain. So the key is how fine-grained the information is there from this study, including big holes in the distribution of the species. You can see the gray spots where people did send in bird counts but did not find the bird. So those are obviously biologically real holes in the distribution. Think about what those holes mean. We can actually begin to correlate those holes with environmental features, either local or weather or bigger picture, longer term things. And here, of course, is one of the most spectacular stories facing us in North America in the 21st century. The Eurasian collared dove, introduced into the West Indies, got to Florida in the late 1980s. There it was in 1999, 2005. It was across the southeastern U.S. Here are the Great Backyard Bird Count snapshots for the Eurasian collared dove for the next several years. Watch the west and the North Prairie. There's 06. There's 07. There's 08. Look at the Great Plains. Look at Washington State. 09, it's well up into Canada. Look at the difference between 06 and 09. There's 2010, now widespread across California, all across Western Canada. Now it's in Alaska, 2011. And there's our 2012 count. A remarkable explosion of a species. And we can talk a lot about that particular species and its biological story, but from my standpoint, the real story is the information that's suddenly available to us in fine-grained detail is a consequence of the existence of birders and the existence of the internet. I regard the internet as the most important invention since fire, or the wheel. Fire, wheel, internet. I put it in the same scale. And so we began in the early 2000s to say we've got to do functionally Great Backyard Bird Count scale stuff all year round, and we ultimately have to do it everywhere, where we can end up having some scientifically scalable information at across big time scales and across the entire year. In June of 2010, eBird was in good enough shape, bulletproof enough from a data entry standpoint to go global. And so now, over the last 2 years, we've done it all over the world. Functionally, it's a tool for gathering and archiving that information so that 100 years from now, information about the American robin and the wood thrush will be available to the people at that point that want to understand what's happened across the intervening times, and to turn back around and give this information back out to people so that it can end up affecting their behavior in a variety of ways. And I'll end the lecture tonight by talking about some of the things we are beginning to learn about that, because fundamentally, remember our mission, we're using birds to interpret and preserve the global biological ecosystem with the idea that we can someday live side by side with these functioning natural systems. So is it possible that we now have a tool to get us enough information that we can use the birds for exactly what they're the best for? To get humans to start thinking about doing this idea. I just a couple days ago chose this common species again to illustrate the region that we're in here, and a little bit of the functionality of eBird for those of you who haven't played with it. This is I chose your American robin, and I said, let's see where they've been reported over the last couple of years. In this region, you can see in blue, it's a pretty common bird. You can also ask questions about the seasonality of the American robin. So I restricted this search to Dutchess County. And there's the annual cycle for American robin in Dutchess County. You can see that it's present but rare in the wintertime. You can see exactly the pace at which they appear, exactly the timing of those appearances, and then finally back down more gradually in the fall. You can also ask questions about how common are they. You can see the two seasons, the shoulder seasons, where you see them in very large flocks, if you see them at all. And so on. And eBird does this for you. So one of the things we wanted to do from the beginning was allow people to explore to their heart's content. And that's what's happening. We have many more people going into eBird to play with the data than we actually have people going in there to add data still to this day. Well, we also have things for the hothead birders like rare bird alerts. You can do trip planning. You can get to a place and actually ask for that place. What are the seasons that certain birds come? This is all built into the functionality of eBird. And so when you can ask questions like this one, I asked this one just for fun because, for this time of year, for birders, if any serious birder sort of, I don't have Philadelphia vireo on my year list yet. That's the one you're usually lacking, right? Where could I see a Philadelphia? So I went in, this is yesterday actually, I went in and said, where had Philadelphia vireos been reported in the Dutchess County region in September, which is not very old yet. Right? There's the Philadelphia vireo report. And here we are. And you can actually pop onto it and say, oh, that's not too far away. Who saw that? And you can actually go in there and find out the guy. So now you're exposed. But you can also see where Charlotte, you can actually click in and see his whole checklist. One of the most commonly asked questions about citizen science data altogether is, how do you deal with the crowd? How do you know that everybody who reports Philadelphia vireo actually saw the Philadelphia vireo as opposed to kind of a greenish red-eyed vireo? Well, obviously we don't. But we have a lot of tricks by which we can actually go in and detect things that don't make sense. One of those tricks, the most important of those tricks, is we simply build filters, local filters, that month by month change and make it inappropriate to put in, for example, Philadelphia vireo in November, because they ain't here. So if you put that in November, your whole thing comes up with a flag. You get a very polite little email from the charming eBird editor saying, excellent observation of that Philadelphia vireo. Mind giving us a few more details about it. And so we've built in a number of tricks that actually reduce to a surprising minimum the number of obviously wrong or even probably wrong things. A few wrong things will always come in, but the huge power of citizen science information is its mass. So when we have a huge army of people putting these things in, the biases don't exist anymore, and we can find signal in the noise amazingly. And so mass is important, and we are now finally, in our view, achieving some spectacular mass in eBird. This is the growth in the use of this tool. Checklists in orange, you probably can't see those numbers. The month of May, which was our peak, was 270,000 checklists submitted for eBird in the month of May, with close to 450,000 observations. We just crossed the 100 millionth observation mark in eBird. Why is that important? I stressed mass a second ago. Because now, up until now, or recently, eBird has been a tool to allow you to manage your own information and put it into a common database that's going to be archived. but it was still short of the ability to actually understand some things from it. We have now begun to turn the corner on that. And so I want to say that the next 50 to 100 years is going to be unbelievable for what we can begin to understand about the world as a consequence of information like this. We are entering the point in which you natural historians, you birders, are now really playing the same game that climate modelers are playing. You're playing with big data sets. And so there's a whole science exploding on how to understand big, complicated, messy data sets. And we are in that right now. I'll just give you the first one of these that we ever did. This is sort of a historical, quaint historical one. We made the first moving one-year cycle graph for eastern Phoebe, and there it is. This is I keep this in so historically neat. You can see for the first time the pulse of northern migration, how they stay put more or less, and they come down in different cycles. The Midwest migrates before the East, and so on. Those are all put together as a consequence of eBird data in combination with a large number of landscape variables. Here's a similar generation version of western meadowlark, a rapidly declining species. You can see how dynamic these ranges are, and see how heterogeneous the distributions of these birds actually are compared to the big blobs that typically the field guides say is the range of the species. This exercise has begun to change how ecologists view animal distribution. And I put this one in because they're migrating right now, and they're so fast in the spring, the solitary sandpiper, and then they dribble down across the entire U.S. and much more casually in the fall. And now I'm showing you of an animation that was made only very recently. This is the eastern wood pewee at 3 kilometer square grid cell resolution. This combines data from 2006 to 2011, and that is the exact average distribution of the eastern wood pewee. You can see in Florida, they appear, the last ones that disappear are in Florida. You can see how heterogeneous that breeding distribution is. You can, right now, you can empathize with it. If you look for pewees in April up here, you're usually foiled because they don't get here till May. There they are, very stable through the breeding season, and then all of a sudden gone, and finally disappearing down to the tropics through Florida. I'm going to show you a couple of these slides, and that last distribution was the modeled distribution for eastern wood pewee. And what we did, and are doing right now, there's a postdoc at the lab working on this right now, is he's taking basically the center of gravity of that distribution and asking where is it day by day. And so with these little tools, you can actually see the speed at which the birds are moving, and you can see it compare species by species, the width of the centers of gravity, and in particular, you can see where they're stopping and disappearing. Here's indigo bunting. I want to show you indigo bunting, how little the indigo buntings like cities. You see Atlanta there? You see St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and down goes indigo bunting, and a few of them actually winter in Florida the entire winter. Remarkable. And there's the buntings, what they call the platelets. Very similar look to that eastern wood pewee, right? In the spring it's blue. You can see how rapidly they go up there. They get to the center of gravity, gets up there, southern Indiana, and then back down. One more example, orchard oriole. Again, these are literally hot off the press. And orchard oriole has actually taught us something new, namely this West Texas story. And they really divide into two different populations. That western population. See, now they suddenly all move westward before they go down. So the patterns of where birds are moving in detail at this point are now apparent for the very first time. There's its analysis. You can see the big movement back westward, and so they use much more of the Mexican zones. Why is that important? That starts telling us the places that we need to pay attention to be protecting the transition time period for orchard orioles. So now that you understand what these platelets are, I just want to show you a couple of different species. This is one that you see regularly here in the Hudson Valley every spring, the black-throated blue. You can see it's a Caribbean winterbird. And so it does basically the same thing, fall and spring. It zooms up the Florida East Coast, gets to the heartland of its ranges up there in the Adirondack land, Hubbard Brook, and then right back down the same track down to the Caribbean. So uncomplicated movement. You can see its speed of movement is very fast in the spring. Different species, same breeding ground. Black-throated green warbler. That's a bird that winters in Central America. And you can see it's got the same route, fall and spring, but it's based on the West Gulf Coast route. Again, very quick migration during that spring period on their way to the breeding grounds. Got to get there quick, get that pair going. Look at this difference. Hugely fast movement of bobolinks north, and then they stop at Virginia. What is that about? Here's another example, even more amazing. How different from the other warblers we were just looking at. What this is accentuating is the fact that the black-hulled warbler doesn't use the southeastern U.S. in the fall. It actually jumps off and does its transatlantic flight from Cape Hatteras and the Delmarva Peninsula. This analysis has a whole lot of applications to it for allowing us to browse information and start thinking about things we have not thought about before. Paces of movement, breadth of width of distribution patterns as they move. The best example that I've seen, and it's now we're working with the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy to do this with about 50 species in California. And because this is such a beautiful example and a pretty charismatic bird, the long-billed curlew, I'm going to show you the annual cycle of the long-billed curlew here, as reflected from citizen science data, modeled on top of land coverages and about 200 other variables. And I'm going to tell you the trick to how this is being done in a second. But there they are in the beginning of the spring, slow movement north. Movement speeds up. You can see the map on the left correspondingly. Migrating up there, up into the Great Plains where it's a breeder. There it is on its breeding ground. You can see the platelets we call them platelets that stop there at the top. So there they are on the breeding ground. And then as it comes down, same story, back down a little farther west. Look at that little indication that for a period of time in the migratory season, they stop. They slow down almost to a stop before finally getting to where they spend their winter. So what the Nature Conservancy has now recognized with these data is that these data actually tell us the points in the annual cycle in which we need to go and find the birds, where the birds most concentrate, to identify the exact places that are the most important to these birds during that very important staging time before they get to the wintering ground. So my point is not so specific to the curlew. My point is the general one, is that we now are literally beginning this year, to make these data available to a bunch of different applications for trying to use them for precisely our original hypothesis. I chose this example too because the eastern meadowlark, as you know here, is a rapidly declining bird in New York. It's functionally gone from many parts of the state at this point. And at this scale, we can see eastern meadowlark and where the most likely possibilities of finding it are. But it turns out that there are some places that are populated enough by people and birders that we can actually take the accuracy, this is the accuracy at the New York State scale, but in the Great Lakes coastal area, we can actually get accurate down to less than a kilometer squared. And we can actually find the places, the exact spots that this bird most depends upon during the breeding season in this particular part of New York. And why? By going to the places and asking questions about them. And eventually getting to those spots and asking the question, what can we do to improve the landscape in the surrounding regions to make a few more of those dots light up? And so we can actually ask things about the habitat of each of those little spots and what the percentage probability is of the meadowlark being there, and so on. We're just at the beginning of this. The power that lies in the distribution of birds across the space and time across the world is immense. We have now begun to work with partner organizations in the not-for-profit world and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to produce the almost annual State of the Birds reports. And in the 2011 version, we actually used for the first time these maps to calculate the responsibilities for each of the federal agencies in western U.S. for each of the species of birds for which we had maps, concentrating on the 50 most endangered. These data are now beginning to be applied specifically by organizations like BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service to change their land management policies. I'll just conclude by saying that we know that birds don't just spend their time up here, but that they winter down there, and they winter together with a very large and rich diversity of resident species in the tropics. And so our job is to build eBird-like things for every country in the world in culturally compatible languages and styles, working with partners in those regions who will be the keepers of the exercise, and who can help us actually genuinely turn this into a global thing. After all, getting kids involved in this, I just closed that picture. Getting kids involved produces adults with passion and knowledge. This kid spent a day with one of our board members, Eduardo Santana, taking birds out of a mist net. That's a picture of him back in his early days. That's a picture of the same individual today who's working with the ejidos of Jalisco and other western Mexican states to talk about environmentally sensitive ways of using the landscape. Why? It's because of the power of birds. This kid fell in love that day taking birds out of the mist net. It happens. They are powerful. So I want to close by just giving you what I am privileged to look at in a few days. It'll look like this. This is what I look at from my deck in Ithaca, New York. That's mostly forever wild landscapes across the way there. You guys don't need me to tell you it looks like that most of the time. It's a privilege to be able to be gaining a real sense of the pulse of that landscape. But I want you not to look at that picture and see my place. I want you to look at this picture, close your eyes if you need to, and see your place. Because every one of you has a place. Every person in the world has a place. Imagine the fact that we now have available to us the capacity to have every person in the world genuinely act as the biological sensors for how we're doing, for what's moving, what's growing, what's declining. Being able to pinpoint our attentions to places because we actually found them. Imagine the idea that all the people in the East had such an opportunity when the passenger pigeons were still flying around. That the alarm bells could have been signaled in the 1860s and 70s instead of the 1880s and 90s. We'd still see passenger pigeons today. This is the idea. That common birds can signal to us important changes in the landscape, important ways in which we're affecting the landscape. Our goal is nothing less than a brand new relationship between humans and the planet. And we're getting there. This is the map of eBird submissions during 2011, 2 million hours of bird watching mapped across the world. We're not there yet. You see a lot of dark spaces, but those dark spaces will fill up eventually. This place is our only home. It is our place of origin, and for most of us, I suspect it's our house of worship. By using the kind of power that we have as observers, and the kind of power that birds have as capturers of us, and yes, the power that the internet now supplies us to accumulate our knowledge, analyze it together, and motivate people for action. This is how we're going to eventually figure out how we can fit in with all this grandeur. Thank you all very much. did go a little over. I apologize. I'm trying hard to stop it.
Are you willing to take a question?
Sure, here, I can take a question too, yeah. Yes.
Studying the role change migration of birds due to climate change.
Are we studying the migration of birds owing to climate change? Yes, indeed. That's actually a big area of concentration right now. We do have some signatures already that suggest that those center of gravities of distributions of many eastern North American birds are drifting northward. Many more are going northward than are going southward. In fact, almost none. Cowbird, I think, is the one that's going southward, but that's because of feedlots in Texas. So most North American birds are either stable right now in the winter or are drifting northward. Larger scale questions are underway about birds that breed farther north. We are quite sure that the Arctic breeding continues. Shorebirds especially are going to be very hard hit are being hit now by climate change because of the fast pace of change in the Arctic. I actually have a grad student right now who's just finishing a PhD on Hudsonian godwit. It's shown that they've changed their migration pattern 9 days, arriving 9 days earlier now in Alaska than they did in the 1950s. But they're not in Churchill. So it's a complicated situation because interior North America associated with climate change is actually suffering wildly erratic winters, including some terrible long springs. So it's a complicated story, but it's a very big story right now. Good question.
Here?
We had in our yard last week the largest collection of blue jays I have ever seen. There were 30 of them, making more noise, moving together.
Do you have a bird feeder?
A what?
Do you have a bird feeder?
Yes.
Do you feed the sunflower seeds?
Yes, but
Yeah.
they haven't been at the bird
They have,
feeder.
well, it's September, so the blue jay is a very, very interesting bird. It's an erratic migrant. Some years they move in very large numbers south, and they start right about now. So you're seeing migratory blue jays probably. The other thing, the reason I asked about the bird feeder is this time of year, the ones that are resident. Some of you, I suspect, like me, you keep a pretty good stock sunflower seed feeder, especially fall and winter, and the blue jays just go crazy at it, and they're caching them. So they're just hoarding them. You do them back and forth all day long, and so you keep it, and it's not just a local territorial blue jay, it can be 20 or 30 blue jays in the region. Hey, Mrs. McGillicuddy's bird feeders. so they can just rob you blind. They love peanuts. They love peanuts, yeah.
How about one more? Right here.
Notwithstanding the fires of the Southwest right now, the drought that we're having, of course, severe drought in the Midwest, how is that immediately going to affect migration this year?
We have a
Survival rate.
great question. How's the drought? And it is a pretty big multi-year drought in parts of the U.S. right now. How is that affecting bird migration? It's affecting it a great deal. And there are certain birds that are especially responsive to that. But the signature example this year, 2012, is dickcissel. Big areas of the West, Oklahoma, North Texas, Kansas, the zone that typically is the heartland of dickcissels. It's just too dry for them, so the entire upper Midwest was filled with dickcissels this year. It's one of the biggest dickcissel years on record for many of the northern states. The good news part of that story is that dickcissel is one of many species, especially the sparrow group, that has probably gone through erratic cycles of aridity and things forever. And so they're actually quite good at coming to the spot that they expect to be able to use and saying, nope, not this year, and going to find another spot. So it's not like they go and die somewhere. They say, I'm going to go find a place that's a little bit better equipped to handle me. And in the Great Plains of the old days, at least, that was a tolerable strategy because it's a big zone, and of course, as you go north, you're going to get into some different weather patterns, and so you'll find them. So that whole group, the sparrow finch group, is responding, and many of them are not actually in a serious decline right now. There are some that are. Some amazing stories underway right now with the crossbills too. Big issues going on with pine mortality and cone crop failures in the Rocky Mountains as a consequence of the warmer winters. And so there are a few of the big populations of red crossbills that look like they're really going down. So a lot of stuff underway right now. There's a lot of attention to it right now.
John, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for coming tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you on October 19th for Gary Lovett talking about pests and pathogens in forests. Enjoy the weekend.